Hi, you're listening to Bonus Points, the official podcast of Mr. Astle's theology class. Join us as we put out into the deep and explore the world of theology and beyond.
Today, I'm answering more questions from you, the listener. Let's begin. So, first of all, I would like to say thank you for tuning in. I know I've said this before, but I'm always blown away just by how many people are listening and sharing. When I first started this, I thought my audience would be me, myself, and I. And so I am beyond grateful that there are so many people who are tuning in and hopefully finding something of value here. Today, I'm going to be answering some more questions from listeners. If you would like to submit a question for a future episode of Question and Astle, head on over to the show's website, which is bonuspointpodcast.com. And I will be sure to answer it on a future episode. So I have my list in front of me. If I don't get to all of them, which I know this happened last time, if I don't have time to answer all of them, I will save the ones we don't get to for the next Question and Astle. In fact, the first several questions today were submitted before the first Question and Astle. I said I would hang on to them, and I did, and here they are again. So without further ado, let us begin. This first question comes from Favorite Student Strikes Again. Howdy, no idea who you are. What is the best Star Wars movie? So when I hear this question, 3 movies immediately come to mind. 3.5. I know that the objective right answer is Empire Strikes Back, and I agree it is a fantastic movie, but I'm going to tell you about the 3 that came to mind when I read the question. The first one that popped in my head was Return of the Jedi, and some of you immediately stopped listening. I get it. I recognize that it is not, according to those objective criteria, it's not the best Star Wars movie. It's not even the best movie from the original trilogy, but it holds a special place in my heart because growing up, that was my favorite movie of the, at the time, 6. So I love Return of the Jedi. It'll always just have that place for me. The second movie that came to mind immediately was Revenge of the Sith. Again, part of it's nostalgia, because I really started getting into Star Wars in 2005, which is when Revenge of the Sith was in theaters. It was the first Star Wars movie that I saw in theaters, and just kind of getting into the larger culture of it around that time. But I also do think it is a fantastic movie. If we're going by the numbers, it is the one that I've seen the most. It is the one that I most rewatched today. If you were to come to my house at a time when Star Wars is on, that's probably what's on the screen. The third one that came to mind was Rogue One, which is one of the anthology movies, obviously, but I think that it really set the standard for what an anthology movie should be. You know, in one sense, they took 1 or 2 lines from one of the Skywalker saga movies and expanded it into a whole movie, which can go well, it can go poorly. But it was such an important line, and it led so directly to the plot of Episode 4. I thought it was really well done. The characters, the storyline, just everything about it. I love it. I try to go back and watch that one pretty frequently as well. So in no particular order, and for very few particular reasons, the 3 Star Wars movies that came to mind: Return of the Jedi, Revenge of the Sith, and Rogue One. Our next question comes to us from listener Patrick D. Thank you, Patrick. Which apostle would you like to have with you in a fight? Immediate answer, anyone but Judas. I don't think I would not want him. He would not have my back in a fight. But, okay, let's think about this. I've narrowed down my answer to 2, and I can't decide which one. The first one, and the one that I thought of first, would be Simon Peter. You know, he's a fisherman, so he's got to be strong. He's well built. He's got the muscles, and he's the Rock, right? Like, you want, if there's an apostle nicknamed the Rock, you want him by your side. Although, again, if we're going by nicknames, James and John, sons of thunder, they might, really all the apostles just, they have kind of this, they're ready to fight vibe. Aside from Peter, my other answer would probably be Simon the Zealot. So he was, before becoming an apostle, he was a member of an extremist sect called the Zealots, who were looking forward to the day that the Messiah would overthrow the Romans, and they were preparing for that in a very practical way. So we assume that Simon the Zealot had some military background, or at least some martial training, which could really come in handy in a fight. So yeah, I'd say one of those two, either Simon the Rock, Peter, or Simon the Zealot. So either way, I want to go into battle with a Simon on my side. Our next question comes to us from listener Matthew R. Thank you, Matthew. What is your opinion on the Christianity in the Lorax cinematic universe? So I needed some context on this one. When this question was first presented to me, I had no idea what it was asking. So if you're likewise confused, here's what Matthew's referring to. In the Lorax, which I don't think I've seen the new one. If I have, it was a long time ago, and I don't remember much. But I did find the context on this. There's a scene where a crowd of people is gathering to take turns beating up the Onceler, I think. And if you look at the crowd, you can see among those lining up is a nun. Or at least somebody who's dressed in a habit like a nun. And I think nuns show up occasionally, but you can infer from this, well, if there are nuns in the Lorax universe, then there must be Christianity in the Lorax universe. And so what does that imply? Does that lead to, what does it say about Christianity if it exists in the Lorax universe? So I think it's hard to say. Just because there's somebody dressed the way a nun in this universe dresses, that doesn't necessarily mean that is a nun, and that if so, Christianity as we know it exists in that universe. So I don't think that there's necessarily a strong connection in that regard. But let's say there is. Let's assume that is proof for us that Christianity as we know it exists in that cinematic universe, to which I would say, fantastic. I don't want to say too much about what this means for the Lorax specifically because, again, if I saw the movie, I remember none of it. So hopefully I'm not misrepresenting what the Lorax is. It seems to me, from my limited knowledge, that the Lorax is a rational, non-human species. And so that would raise some questions about where does the Lorax fit into the larger scope of salvation? And our answer for that would be very similar to what we would say about the possibility of aliens or extraterrestrials being baptized. So, setting aside the Lorax as an individual, we can also note some overlap between the theme of the movie and some important concepts from Christianity, namely the concept of stewardship of creation. So, stewardship is one of the major themes of Catholic social teaching. And it's the idea that when God gives Adam and Eve dominion over creation, that entails both a right to use creation and also a responsibility to preserve it, especially for future generations. So there's a lot of overlap in that regard between the message of the Lorax as this plea for stewardship, really, and the concept in Catholic social teaching. Now, I'm going to do an episode in the future on some similarities and differences between the Catholic approach to stewardship and many of the trends found in modern ecology. But at least on the basic level, there's some overlap there. There's some similarity there. Both the Lorax and Catholic social teaching encourage us to preserve our common home, to use a phrase that Pope Francis uses a lot. Our next question comes from listener RDW, who asks, do you believe that God created aliens along with us on Earth? So there are a few ways to read this question, and I'm not sure which of them already intended, so we'll try to address all of them. The first way to read this would be God created aliens along with us on Earth in the sense that God created aliens on Earth. which is a very easy no, because by definition, the kinds of aliens or extraterrestrials that we're referring to here refers to life outside of Earth, or especially on another planet. And so aliens on Earth would, by definition, be impossible. Now, a second way we could read this question, do you believe that God created aliens along with us on Earth, would be to say, do you believe that God created aliens, specifically in space or on another planet, along with creating us here on Earth? And to that I would say, perhaps. I'm open to the idea that there is extraterrestrial life, even intelligent extraterrestrial life. I don't want to get too far into things that I haven't researched too much, but there's an interesting paradox that pretty much says, if there is no life on other planets, why not? And if there is, why haven't we had any contact? I guess I'm open to it. I haven't been convinced either way yet by the evidence. I've seen some arguments for both sides, and I, like many other people, just kind of waiting for more convincing evidence or arguments. So I think it's definitely possible, though, that God did create extraterrestrials. And that would be the important point for me to mention here, is that if there are aliens, if there are extraterrestrials, we would say God created them, right? Because God creates everything in the universe, which does include humans. It also includes other rational beings, namely angels and demons. God created them as well. So if we knew that there was another race or another species of rational being, obviously God would have created them as well. Now, the third way we could read this question, do you believe that God created aliens along with us on Earth, is maybe a little bit of, I don't know if this is what our questioner was getting at, but you could read this as asking, did God create aliens on Earth and then remove them from the Earth and put them somewhere else? Again, it's logically possible, but this one I'm going to say probably not. I don't think that that's particularly likely, but all things are possible with God. This next question is a follow-up, kind of a follow-up question on that last one. If we knew that intelligent aliens existed, would that disprove Catholicism? And I'd be happy to say no. We know that God created the entire universe. We know that He created many things in it, especially once we get outside our own little bubble of our familiarity. There are so many things that we had no idea were out there, right? Think of the cosmology that we have now versus, is that the word I want? Cosmology? Understanding of the cosmos that we have now, that we know about stars, and the fact that, yes, there are planets in other solar systems, and there are galaxies, and this is what they look like, and that we're perfectly fine with that. In fact, one of the resources that I'm going to offer in the show notes today comes from the Vatican Observatory, which a lot of people don't even know exists. But the Vatican does fund and operate an observatory that is pretty well known in astronomical circles. They publish in all the major journals. And part of the reason was that Pope Pius XII was kind of an amateur astronomer himself. And so he was personally interested in the project. But also, we want to understand creation better. And that's why good science and good religion can never be in conflict, because, first of all, they're answering different questions, but all good science is trying to understand the universe better, and that's going to help us to understand its creator better. And so the Vatican sponsors this observatory. I want to say it is somewhere, the actual observatory is somewhere in the American Southwest, but don't quote me on that. But anyway, I'm linking an article from them that addresses this question specifically. If they found aliens, would that be problematic? And we would say no. There are other questions that come up, like could you baptize an alien? Would you need to baptize an alien? And those are more speculative. the short answer for a lot of those questions is we would have to wait and see what they're like. We'd have to figure out what was actually going on here. We can't just give a blanket answer. But I'm also going to link in the show notes to Jimmy Akin's podcast, Mysterious World, which I'm a big fan. But he addresses a lot of questions about aliens and can you baptize them? Can they get married to us? Stuff like that. So, short answer, if we knew that aliens existed, would that disprove Catholicism? No. Our next question is one that I thought was going to be a lot more complicated when I started researching it because this question came up and I didn't know the answer, so I promised to look into it. And I thought it was going to be a whole thing. It's actually pretty straightforward. The question is, why do we call them the pearly gates? We refer to the entrance of heaven, especially in a lot of jokes, as the pearly gates. And the question was, where does that come from? Why do we call them that? And I was so ready to jump down that rabbit hole. It turns out that is pretty much just a quote from Scripture. So Revelation 21 describes the New Jerusalem. The Apostle John has this vision of a new Jerusalem coming down out of heaven, prepared like a bride. And in verse 21, or in the verses leading up to verse 21, it's describing the city and the walls around the city and the foundation that the city is on. And in verse 21, it says how the walls of the city have 12 gates. So strictly speaking, these are the gates of the New Jerusalem, not necessarily the gates of heaven. But that would be another interesting conversation, is what does Revelation mean when it says a new heavens and a new earth and New Jerusalem? And are these three things the same? What's the difference? But for now, we'll just say, to answer the question that we've been asked, verse 21 of Revelation 21 says, "And the 12 gates were 12 pearls, each of the gates made of a single pearl, and the street of the city was pure gold, transparent as glass." So there you have it. Why do we call them the pearly gates? Because Revelation 21:21 calls them the gates of pearl. So there you go. That was nice and easy. Our next question is unfortunately not as easy. And this comes from listener JR. Thank you, JR. Could an angel possess somebody the way a demon does? I was expecting to find a direct answer to this somewhere. I consulted a variety of sources that address a lot of questions about angels and demons, from Thomas Aquinas and the Summa, all the way up through some of the books from Peter Kraft, who I would consider him one of the modern angelology experts, or at least somebody who's written a lot about it. And I could not find any reference to this question. So here's the answer that I have managed to put together based on what we do know. And I know I've come to a conclusion, but I was kind of surprised that I've never heard this question. I've never heard anybody who knows what they're talking about address this question before. So I guess it would be helpful to clarify what we mean. When we say that a demon possesses somebody, what does that mean? Well, it means that the demon will take possession of somebody. They will take control of the person's body. Now, Aquinas does say the demon will never take control of the person's soul, but they may gain some measure of temporary control over the person's body. And even when they're not in that period of crisis, they'll remain closely associated with the person. So when a demon possesses somebody, on occasion they will take control of those exterior functions, the bodily functions. Now, in theory, an angel could do that, in the sense, if you're asking, like, well, is that within the realm of an angel's power? Because demons are just fallen angels. And so in terms of their abilities, they are the same. So an angel in that sense could possess somebody, but I would argue that they would not. Because angels only ever do what God tells them to do and what is for the glory of God. And I can't think of a scenario where God would tell an angel to possess somebody, because God values our freedom so much. God allows us to bind ourselves, right? That's what we do so often, and not only in the case of demonic possession, but how often do we bind ourselves to something? Christ even says that whoever is in sin is a slave to sin. And then St. Paul also will say something like that. But I don't see why God would want an angel to possess somebody. So I'm going to say my short answer for that one is they could, from an abilities standpoint, but they would not unless they were commanded by God, and I don't see God doing that. Our next question, did St. Peter die by being crucified upside down? So this is one of those things that you maybe have heard a lot. In fact, sometimes people get weirded out when they see in churches, especially in Rome, using an upside down cross as a symbol, because in our modern pop culture understanding, we think that's a satanic symbol. It's actually a really old symbol for St. Peter. It's called the St. Peter's cross. Why? Because, again, we think that Peter was crucified upside down. Peter, like most of the other apostles, was martyred. And as the story goes, or I should say, like other apostles, was crucified. His brother Andrew was also crucified. But when Peter was crucified, he asked to be crucified upside down because he considered himself unworthy to die in the exact same way that Jesus did. And this story is so well known, even among non-Catholic Christians, that I think sometimes people assume it's in the Bible. It's not. So where do we get this from? Well, we hear Peter's martyrdom alluded to in the Gospel of John. After the resurrection, we have this dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Peter, do you love me? Feed my sheep. And then Jesus alludes to a day when Peter will be led where he does not want to go. And Jesus says, you will stretch out your arms and somebody will take you, basically. And John even says in his gospel that this was referencing Peter's death. But that's an illusion. It's not a very clear statement. The earliest mention that we have that directly mentions Peter's martyrdom comes from the Epistle to the Corinthians by St. Clement of Rome. This is a probably first century letter written by St. Clement of Rome, who was the fourth pope. So you have Peter, and then Linus, Anacletus, and then Clement. And he was writing to the Corinthians. This is one of those early church documents that is super duper important to understanding the New Testament because it almost was part of it. This was one of the, I know I talk a lot about this in class, but the Bible is not just kind of handed to us as a one volume bound, here you go. The canon especially developed over time, and there was some debate. Should this book be included? Should this book be included? And so in the New Testament, books like Jude and Revelation they almost didn't make it in, and this letter of St. Clement almost did. So obviously the Holy Spirit guides the process because the church concluded that this letter was not inspired by the Holy Spirit, but it does remain an important historical source. And if you're in my New Testament class, we're going to be looking at some of these first century documents in just a few weeks. Anyway, in this letter of St. Clement, he mentions that Peter was martyred and nothing else. That's all we get. When we look at the other church fathers, we do hear that Peter, there's a pretty consistent trend of them saying that he was martyred in Rome in 64 AD under the Emperor Nero, which fits with the archaeological evidence we have. The first mention I could find of the crucifixion specifically comes from Eusebius, his book, which we actually mentioned a couple episodes ago. Eusebius' book, Ecclesiastical History or Church History, he specifically mentions Peter being crucified upside down, and I'll have a link to that in the show notes. We also have a 2nd century fragment from it's called the Acts of Peter or the Martyrdom of Peter. We're not super sure that this fragment is legitimate or authentic. Thankfully, that's not our only source for this tradition. long story short, we don't have too many ancient references. And so we would say that the tradition that Peter was crucified upside down, from a historical standpoint, is not reliable. And I don't mean that to imply that it's false, just that we don't have a lot of historical evidence for it. We don't have evidence against it, but we also don't see a lot of mention. So I think that it is probably a true tradition. We just don't see it mentioned a whole lot. I think we have time for one more question today. And this question: does the Bible mention dinosaurs? So I've never thought about this one before, but we hear that Genesis starts in the beginning, and it mentions God creating all manner of land-dwelling animals. And so in one sense, you could say, well, yeah, dinosaurs would be considered under that. You're not going to find specific mentions of dinosaurs as such. And part of that is due to kind of the history of our understanding of dinosaurs. So the word dinosaur does not come about until, I want to say, the 1800s, where we have a lot of paleontologists who are digging up these large skeletons and trying to understand them more. And so dinosaurs as a concept didn't really exist until then, or at least our understanding of dinosaurs. Obviously, the dinosaurs existed. But this does not mean that those 19th century paleontologists were the first people to find fossils or find dinosaur bones. And it's reasonable to see connections between these bones in the ground and stories we have from different cultures of monsters. Think of all the stories of dragons. If you found a dinosaur skeleton, if you found a T-Rex skeleton, but you had no idea about dinosaurs, you just find these huge bones that are much larger than any other animal you're familiar with. It seems to have these huge teeth. It's easy to get from there to the kinds of stories of dragons that we see popping up in different cultures. So it's not as though people didn't know that there were these large creatures. That's what the scriptures say. And again, you're not going to find velociraptors mentioned by name in the Bible. But what you do find, there are a couple times where scripture mentions large, scary animals that sound similar to what we would call a dinosaur, or may be referring to a dinosaur. And the two examples I want to share with you, just for the sake of time, I'm going to limit myself to two. Both come from the book of Job, chapters 40 and 41. And many people, when they hear Job, they think, isn't that the sad guy? And so most of Job is him. He undergoes all the suffering, and his friends try to rationalize it or explain it. But it all builds up to the end of the book where God himself is going to answer Job. When Job keeps asking God, like, why, Lord, why? God is going to answer. And you can sum up God's answer essentially by saying, where were you when I made the universe? Like, you have no idea what I'm doing. You can't see the plan. You can't see the big picture. So who are you to criticize my way of doing things? In the course of that, we hear God reference two creatures. One of them is called Behemoth, and one of them is called Leviathan. So here's one of the things. In Job chapter 40, God says, behold Behemoth, which I made as I made you. He eats grass like an ox. Behold, his strength is in his loins, and his power in the muscles of his belly. He makes his tail stiff like a cedar. The sinews of his thighs are knit together. His bones are tubes of bronze. His limbs like bars of iron. And you hear that and you think, well, that kind of sounds like a dinosaur, I guess. And sure, we wouldn't call a dinosaur Behemoth, but if the word dinosaur didn't exist yet, why not? Then a chapter later, in chapter 41, we have another kind of extended description of this sea monster called Leviathan. So we have these two massive, they're described as being monsters, Behemoth and Leviathan. Whether or not that's referring to the creatures that were associated with dinosaur bones back then or something else, that's probably as close as Scripture comes to talking about what we would today call a dinosaur. So there you go. I think that's about all we have time for today. Next week, we're going to be returning to our series on the communion of saints. I'm really excited for that one. So next week, we're going to talk about relics. What are relics, and how do you get, where do they come from? Obviously, if we're going to say a relic is part of a saint's body, there's at some point they got to, there's a procedure there to get that. So we'll talk about that next week. That episode is actually why I decided to start doing this series on the communion of saints, because I thought, the process that we're going to talk about involves references to terms like venerable and blessed. So I thought, well, people need to know what those terms mean. And even before that, I thought it was good to talk about the communion of saints in general. So I'm very much looking forward to next week's episode on relics. In the meantime, what resources can I offer you for today? A few. Thank you for asking. So, like I mentioned, I'm going to link to a page from the Vatican Observatory, a frequently asked questions page which addresses aliens. I also have a link to Jimmy Akin's Mysterious World, which is a podcast about all things strange and mysterious. Yeah. He mentions aliens a lot. He has a couple different episodes that address topics related to extraterrestrials and UFOs. I'm also going to be linking to Revelation 21, which is where we find a description of the pearly gates. And then I'll have links to the Acts of Peter and the Epistle to the Corinthians by St. Clement and Ecclesiastical History by Eusebius. Those were three of the early church sources that refer to Peter's death. And then finally, I'll have links to Job 40 and Job 41, so you can read for yourself about Behemoth and Leviathan. For right now, though, that's all we have time for today. Make sure you subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts. Make sure you share this with somebody, both the show as a concept, but even just this episode, if you think that someone would be interested in one or more of the questions we talked about. And again, if you're looking for an easy way to share, if you're looking for more resources, or if you would like to ask a question for our next installment of Question and Astle, head on over to the show's website, which is bonuspointspodcast.com. Until next time, I am Mr. Astle. You are listening to the official podcast of Mr. Astle's theology class. Please continue to join us as we put out into the deep, exploring the world of theology and beyond. How's that? That's an outro as an intro, right? Or no, that's an intro as an outro right there. Anyway, have a great rest of your day. I hope you tune in again. This has been another episode of Bonus Points.